This episode of the EV Resource Podcast is brought to you by Titan Auto and Tire. Titan has some of the very few independent auto repair shops in Central Virginia that are qualified to work on EVs and hybrids. And from hybrids to Hummers, they fix everything. For more information and to schedule an appointment for your vehicle, go to TitanAutoTire.com. Coming up this episode, I have an informal chat with Greg from the Take It EV podcast about our experiences in the EV world and compare and contrast life in the UK versus the US with our electric vehicles. We get into a wide range of topics, so stick around. I know you're going to love this one. Before we jump in, I want to tell you a little bit about the Take It EV podcast. It's a conversational style podcast that talks to people about their experiences with sustainable transportation, some of the challenges they might have had, and overall, what life is like living with an electric vehicle. Greg has conversations with people about building a better future for all of us. And it's actually amazing. Greg and I have a lot in common, even though we live essentially separate worlds apart. I'm based here in the US and Greg is based in the UK. While there are a lot of differences between the two countries and the experiences of owning electric vehicles in each, there are a lot of similarities as well. So let's jump right into the conversation with Greg and the Take It EV podcast. I tend to have a North American focus. I'll mention things that are happening outside the US, but I do have kind of a US and Canada based focus to things. So hearing just even how the EV experience is in the UK, I think would be valuable. You know, just in terms of curiosity, how the vehicles are used, because I know the UK, what is the long distance that people from
it's called
Land's End to...
John McGrath's
yes.
in Scotland.
Well, that is supposedly a long journey. Yeah,
it is a very long journey.
How many miles is that?
So let's see, John McGrath's to Land's and Landmark. It's 837 miles.
Okay.
It tells me about 15 hours drive.
Right. So, you know, people here 800, like most of what I consider to be like a road trip doesn't start until you've gone 1,000 miles. You know, it's like driving from where I live in Richmond, Virginia. I drove down to Florida and back, and that was a 2,000-mile round trip. No big deal. You know, I did that in a Model S Tesla. But there's people that drive from New York to LA for the Cannonball Run. And like there's, I don't know, an unofficial contest of whoever has the record, you know, but it's like 46 hours in an EV, and people have done it in a gas car in like 23 hours, and it's close to 3,000 miles. I mean, it's just insane. So the usage, people here, the majority of people drive maybe 40 miles a day commuting back and forth to work, maybe grocery shopping or whatever. But there are a lot, that's the average, but there are still a lot of people that drive more than that. Maybe they're at 100 miles a day, where I would imagine in the UK, people are not driving 100 miles a day all that often.
No, but I think the I can't remember the statistics, but it's 20 something miles, 23 or something miles a day is an average for but most cars sit on your drive or whatever for most of the time. Like the cars are, I think 90% of the time the car sits there unused. Yeah. Is this sort of statistic? At least in Europe, it might be completely differently in the US because obviously. But just to give you an idea, like we're talking about the Le Jog and 840 miles, just rounded up. Most of that, if you drive this distance, is going to be through villages and towns. Like you're going to have maybe 10, 15 minutes at a time where you're away from any inhabitable zone. Whereas in the US, I'd imagine you drive sometimes and you're away from anything for an hour, sometimes probably more.
It depends on what part of the US. Once you get off the coasts and into the middle of everything, you can drive for hours between cities. It's a nearly seemingly endless expanse of nothing but the highway, and then you look off to the sides and it's either rolling grassland or cornfields. My parents actually live out in the middle of the country in Kansas, and I drove out to visit them last summer. And you cross the Mississippi River, where St. Louis is on I-70, and you just go west of there, and it's like civilization disappears. I mean, it's really bizarre. So yeah, you can go quite a distance, and you're not going to be anywhere near a place where a lot of people live. I mean, there's smaller towns and everything, but I don't know. This might sound bad to anybody living out in the Midwest, but not something worth stopping at.
I get that. I hear that a lot from people who been or live in the US. I actually never been to US. I've been to Canada multiple times. I used to run a business with a friend in Vancouver, but I've never ventured down the border.
Yeah, well, I've never been over to the UK, and that's something I've always wanted to do because I'm so fascinated by the history and the culture. Because here, the US has only existed for a little bit more than 200 years. And if you consider the colonial period, now you're at like 400 years.
Yeah.
Well, that's nothing compared to the UK or Europe. That's been, history there is thousands of years.
Yeah, I mean, we got a castle in town that's like from 1200s or 1100s something. So
that is just that just blows my mind that it's like, oh yeah, people, things are that old. I think one of the reasons that I got into electric vehicles was my fascination with technology. I've always been interested in efficiency, transportation efficiency as well as for the house. But the technology aspect of it is what really kind of captured me and drew me in. And then, of course, I got one to save money, monthly, because we were saving about $50 a month when we got the first EV. And now with the second one, it's a few $100s a month. So I think that's probably what originally got me into it, because I'm totally a geek for new and exciting things.
It's a similar story with most people around here. People either got their EVs because they had a very good deal on Nissan Leaf, or a cheap car basically, and with most families at least in the UK, people would have 2-3 cars per family of 3, and the second car would be usually the sort of the runabout. A main car would be taken for longer journeys, but there will be a second little car that will be just taken to shops or drop kids off to school, whatever. A runaround kind of car. And those cars don't do massive mileages, so people would just basically buy an EV for that. And if the car had 80-mile range, it's fine. You're not going to do more than 40. So, and then there were crazy people like me who got themselves like a car that can do about 107 mile. That was my first EV, Nissan Leaf, 30 kilowatt hour Nissan Leaf. And on the first year of ownership, I took it from where I am to Edinburgh and then Glasgow and back, over a long weekend. And I would have to stop every 50, 60 miles to charge for half an hour, but I didn't mind. It was fun.
Yeah, I did a similar trip in my, I have a Chevy Spark EV, and on the highway, doing 60, 65 miles an hour, it will only go about 60 to 65 miles. So yeah, you drive for an hour, stop and recharge for 20 minutes to a half hour or so, and then get back on it. I didn't care. I think most people probably wouldn't want to do that. No. I think that's probably something that's very unique to people that are excited about the technology, like you or me. I think the general public doesn't want to stop unless they themselves have to, like either to grab a bite to eat or use the restroom. They don't want to stop because the car needs to stop.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have a Kia e-Niro now, which is in theory, this car can do about 280 miles on a charge. In practice, about 250. To drive 250 miles in the UK takes about 4 or 5 hours. Even if you drive on motorways or sort of freeways, as you guys call them, on sort of larger roads, because if you think about it, your average speed will still depend on the traffic, and it will still depend on you transitioning between roads. It's not like in here you just hit a road and go. Even if you drive on a major motorway like M1 or whatever, there will be areas where there's restricted speed because they're doing something. There will be other people you have to overtake and move about. I've never done a proper range test because the range depends on so many things. The terrain, the weather, the all sorts of things, on how you drive. I tend to be pretty heavy on the pedals, so the car has not. And this car has just so much power. It's it looks like a family car. I mean, it is a little family car, but it has like over 200 brake horsepower. It goes like a stink. It has more torque than the tires can deliver to the ground. So you can step on it and it will spin the wheels. So you have to be careful.
If you like your tires.
Yes, yeah.
Sometimes I want them to spin because it's an action of evangelism for EVs to other people that might think that they're better or that their car is better because it's gas powered. And you're like, well, it's a way of communicating with other people. That's really all it is, right?
But a number of times that I've driven just around the town, and the surface of the road is a bit more slippery, whatever, and you step on it, not even fully, but just like tap it, and it spins the wheels, and everyone's looking what's happened because they can't hear the engine; they just can hear, so they think something's bad happened. Yeah,
right.
And my wife's like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I didn't intend that to be like, it's
like it just happened." Sometimes it's great when you want it to happen. When you don't want it to happen, it's annoying.
I agree.
That's interesting. That's something that I don't think people really talk about, like the experience of driving an EV. I mean, people will say, oh, you need tires, but they won't say, hey, if you're not careful, if you got a little bit of lock into the steering wheel, if you turn it slightly or the road surface, maybe there's some sand or gravel or whatever, you'll spin the tires all over the place. When somebody now is interested in an EV, they're curious and they want to go out and buy one, they're probably not being told, hey, you're not going to want to floor it everywhere. Like, you need to be kind of going easy on it. And it doesn't matter really what EV it is. I mean, I'm sure your Nissan Leaf did the same thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was a smaller car, narrower tires. So, the width of the tire and the diameter kind of dictates the contact surface.
Sure.
So smaller contact surface, less torque still means you can spin it. I mean, the EVs are all about torque. It's the people often think that it's the brake horsepower and all that dictates how fast the car is, but it's actually the torque, the amount of force that you can put on the lever that actually dictates how fast you can accelerate. And EVs just have virtually flat curve when it comes to torque from 0 to whatever the maximum RPM. So at any point you can just step on it and it will just do what you told it to do.
And I love that.
Yeah. I mean, it's the
it doesn't get old.
I mean, some people call it a Tesla grin, but it's actually an EV grin. Like it's the sort of, it's the thing that when you drive an EV for a bit and you notice these little things, you're like, wow, I love that. This is
Yep. That torque is what sells EVs to people, even if that's not their thing. You get into an EV, maybe you bought it because you want to be environmentally conscious, because you want to save the planet and hug trees, and that's wonderful. And I applaud people that is their desire. But driving an EV and stepping on the accelerator and being pushed back in your seat, that I think probably will sell more EVs than anything else.
Yeah, I think it's funny because anybody who I know who is a piston head, as they call themselves, and likes the sort of engines and stuff, and fine. I mean, all power to them. That's a bit of sarcastic pun that I didn't intend. But they're afraid. Like, whenever I offer them, do you want to just hop on and even just sit in the passenger seat and just drive with me, or just give it a go? They don't want to. Like, they're scared. They know that it will change their mind, and to the point that there's loads of people who are anti-EVs because that's just a natural reaction of some of the, like, depending on your personality, you might have a personality where you do kind of react by being sort of anti something, push it back. It's a natural human reaction.
That first experience in an EV will either change your life or ruin your life.
Yeah,
it will
yeah.
it'll change things because it'll open up your eyes, but it'll certainly ruin your life if you have this anti-EV mindset and now all of a sudden you find yourself liking it. And now there's an internal conflict because you're like, I don't want to like this, but you can't help it. For me, it ruined my life because every single day past that point, I wanted an EV and I didn't have one. And that, until I finally got one, we have like club meetups here called Cars and Coffee, where, everybody with all types of different vehicles, whether it be tuner cars, like the little Honda Civics running around, or old muscle cars, or even exotics like Lamborghinis and Ferraris, everybody will get together and kind of talk about each other's cars and walk around and check it out and see what else is out there. They're so anti-EV, like really threatened by it. It's amazing. And it's interesting how human nature is universal. That's something that anywhere you go in the world, whether it's here in the US or with you in the UK, I think we run into these people that so much of their passion and in many ways their identity is in these cars that is becoming a technology that is fading. The internal combustion engine, it has a death date. It will cease to be made. So it's like, why do you care how a car is driven? You should care how it feels when you're driving it. But who cares what's under the hood if it burns something or not? Like, I don't know. That part I don't get it.
Neither do I. I mean, I remember when I had my first EV, because I used to live in London back then, and I would just use it as a sort of commute around London, or a device to commute around London, I should say, because parking used to be free in some of the bits of London, up to 4 hours, and then you got free charging. So it was my way to kind of commute into town, into the center of town or city, I should say, and back home. And I didn't have a charger at home for, because we lived in a flat and there was no charging points, like for flats. We didn't have a parking space. I mean, we had a parking space, but it didn't have its own charging point. There was no way to fit one in.
Oh, wow.
So I had to rely on the public charging infrastructure. Most of the chargers were free. So even if I had to like plug it in somewhere and then leave the car there and then walk home for 15 minutes and then walk back in the morning, that was fine by me, because virtually all chargers were free, so I could just commute for free to London. All I had to do is just basically sit in the car, which driving in London is not a fun experience, I can tell you that. Everyone's stressed, everyone wants to go quickly, and there's just cars everywhere. It's slow, but it was free, so, and it was an EV, so I was happy to do it. I didn't feel guilty of like polluting the air in the city. But you got to park in some of the sort of iconic areas of London, and which was pretty amazing. And like the theaters, people would go to the theater in the evening, and you would unplug your car to go home, and then a cute little couple would come up to me and say like, "Oh, this is interesting. Is this the is this like how far this can go? 80 miles on a charge? Oh, okay. But there is an engine in there." I'm like, no, that's it. It just relies on electricity, and so often somebody would say, in a nice kind of English way, "Good luck," as in, I'm terribly sorry that this isn't probably going to work for very long, but yeah. But it was in a very kind of polite way, and I thought to myself, whoa. And now fast forward 5 years or 6 years now, and EVs are a bit more mainstream, at least here in Europe. It's or in the UK, it's there's thousands of them being sold every month, and the demand is way higher than the supply. Never mind the Teslas, but all sorts of other car manufacturers.
Else.
Yeah, because not everyone wants a Tesla. Like, let's be honest.
Sure. My ideal car, what I would love to have would be the Renault Zoe. I would love to have one of those. We don't have it's a French brand. We don't have that here at all. And I'm like, man, that would be such a cool car, especially with the larger battery pack. I don't
50
remember if
kilowatt hour.
it is 60.
No, 50. 50.
50. Okay.
I mean,
Yes.
it's a small car, so it gets enough
Still.
range out of 50.
Oh yeah. I mean, look, my Chevy Spark has an 18 kilowatt hour battery pack. Like it's I'm used to small batteries. But that would be such a cool car to have. Or the Honda E. You guys can get the Honda E, I think, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not available in the US, is it?
No.
Oh.
This country, and it bugs the heck out of me, and I think maybe I belong in Europe because I love small cars or weird cars or just quirky cars. And it seems like the general population over here in North America wants trucks and big SUVs. And I'm going, because even when everything switches over to electric, and that might be 50 years from now here, but there will be a point where just, it will be a rare occurrence to see a gas powered car driving on the road. There will still be efficient vehicles and inefficient vehicles, like the Hummer EV. It's over 9,000 pounds, a 200 kilowatt hour battery pack. And I mean, the equivalent is 47 miles to the gallon equivalent here, according to the EPA. It's still a Hummer. It's still this big, massive tank that happens to be road legal somehow. Like I said before, I'm big into efficiency. So I want a vehicle that's going to get 4.5, 5, 6 miles per kilowatt hour. Sure, throw a little bit bigger of a battery pack, maybe 50 kilowatt hours. Well, shoot, if you are getting 5 miles per kilowatt hour and you have a 50 kilowatt hour pack, that's 250 miles right there,
Yeah. I mean, the one of the reasons I bought myself a little Nissan Leaf is because my diesel car at the time, diesels don't like short journeys, and when I lived in London, I would do 2-3 mile journeys all the time, and the car would just required hundreds of pounds of maintenance costs, like every couple of months. All the filters, and it was a disaster. Plus, I always wanted to have an EV. I test drove a Model S when they came out in here, and I loved it. It was way too expensive for me, and I just didn't feel a need for. I could afford it, but it was like, I could live in that car basically, and live in a small flat, or live in a bigger flat and not have that car. I chose the latter, but Nissan Leaf was all of a sudden affordable, and the repayment was the same as my cost of the diesel car. So I thought, it's the same for me, but I didn't have to pay extra 90 quid or whatever it was, £90 a month on fuel, because charging was free back then in London. So I was like, happy days. And this is why I made the whole trip to Edinburgh and back, because I was just trying to prove to myself that it is possible to travel around the country, so somewhat restricted, but it was I didn't have to pay much for the fuel. In fact, I didn't have to pay anything because it was free to charge everywhere. So it was like, but that was in 2016. In the summer, things have changed obviously since then. I sold that car 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. I can't remember how much I got for it. I think about £7,000. You can sell this. If I wanted to buy the same car that I sold to somebody 2 years ago, I would have to pay £12,000 now.
Yeah.
So I sold it
because
for
demand
7,000.
is so high.
Yeah. And it increased in price, like almost doubled in price.
This is the time, if you've got a used EV that you don't need or maybe don't want, go sell it now, because this will not last forever. I mean, the prices will come back down, and anybody that wants to buy one, I tell them, I'm like, look, if you don't need something right now, if your time frame's 6 months, a year and a half, even, maybe it's better to wait from an economic standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. So because of the corona sort of pandemic situation, there's a shortage of almost everything, because the sort of the buildup of resources, and the normally warehouses would be full of spare parts and whatever. That's all gone. That was all exhausted by us using it, but nobody was replenishing it, obviously, and it's hit manufacturers massively. So any car you want to buy, whether it's an ICE car or an EV now, you have to wait months
Yep.
I mean, at least in the UK. And
it's somewhat like that here. I mean, inventory
Yeah.
for dealerships is very low.
I mean, I'm sure there's some cars that nobody wants that you can just go and buy.
Sure,
because
but nobody wants those.
Exactly. Unless you're like really desperate, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to get into charging, because I'm happy to talk about it. I don't know.
Well, honestly, I mean, we've filled up this time. I would love to just roll with what we've got. I think this has been a very a neat conversation, you know, somewhat of an insight to both worlds a little bit. But I think it's probably good if we go ahead and end things so I can run out and collect my children.
All right, thank you. Thanks.
All right, pleasure.
Bye. Bye.
So there you go. If you're interested in following along with Greg and the Take It EV podcast, you can find them on whatever platform you're listening to this. You can also find Take It EV on YouTube and Twitter. Before we end, I have a couple of announcements and requests. If you enjoy the EV Resource podcast with the weekly news and interviews and occasional conversations like this one, I encourage you to please share it with your friends, family, anybody that you might know that's interested in electric vehicles and keeping up to date on the latest and greatest. If you would, on Apple or Google Podcasts, or probably any podcast platform, leave a review. That will help other people find the podcast by bumping it up in the listings, I guess. If you want to listen to any of the previous EV Resource podcast episodes, you can find them on our webpage under the podcast section and all of your favorite podcast platforms. If you're looking for more EV Resource content, I would suggest subscribing to the YouTube channel. I've got a shoot coming up next week at the track I'm super excited about, so definitely keep an eye out for more content, especially if you like the Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis EVs that are on the eGMP platform. You're going to get a lot of great content that you want to see. I encourage you to follow EV Resource across all social platforms: LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We also have a magazine that's monthly. It's digital, so it gets sent to you via email. You can go to the webpage and sign up for that. And I want to thank our Patreon supporters, as always: Rajeev Narayan at the director tier, Christopher Lawrence and Andy Cooper at the executive producer tier. And if you enjoy the podcast and feel like I've earned your support, I encourage you to go to patreon.com/EVResource. Check out the benefits that you would get as a supporter. And if you feel like I've earned it, go ahead and join our growing Patreon family. I invite your feedback via email to hello@ev-resource.com. And otherwise, that's it. So thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll see you next time.